So welcome to which will be, I guess, the last of these recordings on a reading guide to things we could design for more than human-centered worlds. And this, well, we're there. This is chapter 8, so the conclusion of the book. And in some ways, it was actually one of my favorite chapters to read. Maybe because it was the last chapter. I don't know. Anyway, to kind of recap what about the book. I don't know if you recall at the outset, I stated that I wanted to unbuild design, and I wanted to do this critically and as sort of a critical and creative speculation on what post-human design might mean. Now, throughout the book, I was really trying to de-emphasize the human role of design, to open up space to design with, to decenter the human, to rethink what it would mean to design with things that are more than human, or think of design in more than human terms. And this partly came around, to the discussion of what I call things. Now, this decentering of the human in design held for me deep entanglements. And these raised several questions, and this is really the way I structured the book. And so the aim of the book was to raise the questions and then to respond, of course, with answers. So the first of these questions is part 1 of the book. How do we know what design is? So I answered this in post-humanist terms by arguing or trying to describe a design that was pluralistic and nomadic. So pluralistic in the sense that there were the different nomadic practices, that there were different ways in which you could have an intentionality about a design. There were different somethings we could design, and therefore different designers. And then it was nomadic in that it wasn't bound by a shared foundation for what design as the discipline is, but rather we're able to situate and ground and embody practices that were in relation to the thing that we were designing, or the something that was being designed. So I spoke specifically about 3 different nomadic practices of design: designing artifacts, designing objects, and designing products. And to open up space for the topic of the book, the nomadic practice of designing things. But also to say that there are many different ways in which you can design. So there are many different nomadic practices of which we can explore and articulate and describe and make claims for what we believe to be the designing of something. And the second question, or was part 2 of the book, is what is the something that is designed? And I answered that it is a relational and agentic thing. So relational in the sense that we can't think of things without thinking of something else. There's a very fundamental understanding of the notion of design with, and we can't think of humans without thinking about others, other humans, but also other non-humans. And in this relationality, there's a fundamental interconnection between humans and things. We are shaped by things, and things shape us, and we can't think of one without the other. So that was one of the key points of discussion in answering this question. And the second was the notion that things have an agentic quality or capacities, that they equally transform the world and have effects. They are alive, so to speak. And this was part of the kind of the technological life world, or the nature culture technicity of a post-human understanding of the world that we're in, and that in a more than human sense, we're really on a continuum of actors in this world who transform and use technologies and are interconnected with technologies as things are with us. And I focused a lot, as an example, on the phototrope, and to point out this interconnectedness between us and things, how the phototrope shapes us into being nocturnal runners, to be able to run in a night urban landscape, to become part of that landscape, but also that we shape, of course, the phototrope into being a running garment, and transform the world to make it runnable. And all of these are interconnected and relational. And the second part of the distributed agency, that things have agency, or non-humans have agency, and they affect and transform the world. And whether it's a 10-year-old matter plant, or the Asian indigo or woad that needs to be fermented, that all come together to make the specific color of Burgundian black, that are these more than human or non-human agentic capacities that transform and make that color happen. And the last question, and this is part 3 of the book, is who is the designer? And as I said, having taken seriously the answers to the previous 2 questions, it was hard to consider the designer as being exclusively human. And so the designer is an assembly of humans and non-humans, and this appears in 2 respects. With respect to the notion of biography. And I described how it is the interconnectedness of the designer and the thing designed that form a biography. They create a life force that inscribes itself into the world. And I just, this notion that as humans and designers, we are radically situated in the world in which we design, and that was the lesson drawn from autobiographical design. And we shape that world as it shapes us, but we inevitably we create a world together, a biography together, and it's through this cohabiting. But what's important, of course, is not only how we inscribe together, and this is the human and non-humans that are involved in the designing of in the shaping of the world, but what it is that we leave behind. And so there's an accountability to biographies, and this is my example of the Sten Gustav Tulin patent on the plastic bag, and of course what we know, the biography or the life world that it in turn created. But also pointed out, biographies to aspire to. So it talked about Children's Village in Canawana, Brazil, and the way in which this was designed to think about the end of life, not just the beginning of life, and how this would return to the very terrain on which it was built. But also, the many examples of anti-biographies, that there's nothing inherent in a biography that would lead to Children's Village, for example, that there is a need to govern, and a second human and non-human assembly that a human designer is part of that gathers what I call the constituency. And the constituency is this way of thinking about not only what we need to design, but who would design, the bringing together of all the matters of concern, the politics of the things, the thing politics that I described, and the participation of other stakeholders, but also non-humans, so there's more than human gathering. And I described it metaphorically as like a kitchen, this sort of gathering of tools, equipments, ingredients, people, politics, the matters, whether it's vegan, whether it's non-vegan, all the things that one would gather, and the different ways in which we can gather. So there's not one way to have a kitchen, for example. And this is the gathering before we know who's going to cook. The gathering before we cook a meal. So in design terms, this is the gathering before we understand or decide whether we need a designer, and then before we might think about what is a thing that we might design. And I tried to bring this to life, so to speak, through the example of the Life Patch Collective and all that was gathered in thinking about do it with others or do it yourself in the context of Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So the first part of the conclusion was the summary of the book. And then the second part really was a way to kind of take a step back and somewhat speak to the readers, speak to the designers. And I categorized this in a couple of ways, but really talked about the fact that the book has an ask. There's an ask of designers. And on one hand, we can think about, and I described what would be required to actually embrace design with, to make that happen, and saw this really for any number of reasons, whether it's a matter of political economy or a matter of cultural and professional change, that this is clearly sets of challenges that when we think about rethinking or unbuilding design. And so seeing this on a long arc, and it's not something that was going to happen tomorrow, but there are ways in which I think it has impacts now, and I described how we, in some sense, I hope the book would just talk to those of other practices of design. So there's, those who are engaged in the designing of products or designing of objects or what other forms of design that are engaged in a practice now. And it really was a question of a certain awareness. How can we shift practice slightly? How can we create other awareness? And so a kind of design with awareness, an understanding, or another way to think about it is a biographical awareness of what it is that we're designing now. So what might this mean? So this was a kind of, think about how we've now, in practice now, we intuit a kind of response in conversations with materials and technologies, the non-human participants in our current practices of design, and begin to see this in the light of distributed agency. How does one make space for the agentic capacities of things that are more than human? And also, related to this, but because things are not completely in our control, the inevitability of unintended consequences. And how I showed how in much of the way we characterize design problems, we tend to remove the unintended consequences from the design process. But to what degree can we fold aspects of that in, just knowing that there are things that are going to happen that we don't control, and how do we make that part of our process? But also as a consequence, we could think about how we might limit the things we make. Think about in a biographical sense, what is the end? Or what are the consequences? What is it not only do we ascribe in the world, but what do we leave behind? And how do we build in mechanisms that maybe allow us to stop and take stock of the consequences of the very thing that we're designing? Or think about how it might end, and then before we decide that we do want this, we do want to cohabit a world with the things that we design. I think there's also related to this is rethinking the relationships with those people who use or live with the things we design, and as a matter of governance, that we think beyond just the use and consumption models, that maybe there's ways to think of collective ownership of things, and that yes, when things are brought into the world, there's a political dimension. So how can the product I make be governed in some sense? How does this fit in perhaps more of a social enterprise than simply an economic enterprise? And lastly, we tend to think about proprietary standards or designing whole platforms and creating whatever it is, the something that we design anew and as a whole. But rather, could we not think ecologically? Are there not niche parts that we can design toward? Can we not build overall sets of products or objects that operate sustainably but interact with each other in sort of a more of an ecological understanding of the contributions that we make through the products or the objects that we design? So much of what I described is really a kind of ask of designers today with very little commitments, just a kind of an awareness of some of the things that we discussed. But of course, I'd like it to go further and think about how designers might embrace design with fully, to take on the commitments of designing with. And I think it's a completely different shift, a kind of not knowing designing within the sort of post-human context of shifting attention and not fully knowing what it is that or the impacts or the effects of the things you're going to design, and of course not operating within a context of distributed agency. But the first is a shift of attention to the first of these commitments would be a shift of attention toward this idea of the human designer as a speaking subject, and what does that mean? How does one what is the speaking subject in this assembly of the human and non-human designer in a biography context, or how does one gather a constituency? And I think it's this what I talked about in the book, about this self-practice of designer, this reflection. And for us, this means a shift of attention. It's a different way of thinking about what our role is as designers. So that's one area I think we need to pay attention to. And there are many ways in which it really speaks to a kind of relationship that we have, a more than human relationship that we have in the context of design. And there are works in post-humanism or related kind of theories outside of design that open this up for us, so we can draw from. So I mentioned two examples. One, this book by Vincent Desprez, who really looked at kind of science studies and biological studies in relation to animals, and saw that a shift of attention, shift of relationship in the way in which what scientists were looking for was perhaps not the right things to show the participation or the animation or the agency of the animals, that they're less objects of study, more subjects of study. So wonderfully titled, "What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions?" And Anna Singh's book on the mushroom at the end of the world, which really points out different kinds of assemblies and different kinds of ecologies that are forming at the edges of capitalism, and in particular in human and non-human assemblies. And she argues for a kind of method an art of noticing. How does one follow and trace, in this case, the Matsuki mushroom, and follow and see all the assemblies and all the connections? And it's a way of understanding relations in the world that we don't currently see, and this could also be applied to design. But it does mean this shift where maybe on the one hand has a shift of attention, but even a shift of practice. And I speak kind of metaphorically when I said we needed to think about being less vertical in the world and more horizontal. That is creating greater points of contact, opening up to greater perceptions of in the design with sense of designing with more than humans or things that are non-human. And I talked about soil stories as a good example of this, and I borrow this from Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, but she talked about different soil stories, and I talked about them in the book, whether it was Bruno Latour's soil scientist in Boa Vista in Brazil, or it was Charles Darwin trying to understand the relationship between worms and soil, or Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's own examination of permaculture. But this willingness to, if we think about this metaphorically as we embody ourselves differently as designers, this really speaks to method. We enact ourselves differently in the world with the materials around us and our processes. And anybody who's been involved in role playing or body storming or any enactments of any kind can start to see how we might change our perspective by changing our embodied relations to the things around us and draw methods on that. And what I've metaphorically said, described as horizontality. But we do even within now the practice of design, and this is emerging, and I've some of this in the book of what I would call repertoires based on speculative design. So speculative repertoires that start to draw out the kind of relations or awareness or understandings we need to have to act on in a design with context. For example, and this speaks to the not knowing. The earlier example of the Kara Sutra, that it was actually having to create and make the car and put it into the world to examine and understand what was this new kind of mobility that Bellini was trying to examine and investigate. Didn't know before making the car, and so this practice of kind of critical design and speculative design of putting things in the world to ask questions. Clearly very much part of the tilting bowl and the counterfactual approach, the sort of the design, something that we wouldn't normally design, to ask the question, what if? And again, I think this is a way of examining some of the relationships that we need as designers to act as speaking subjects, to act as within these assemblies of humans and non-humans, whether it's biographies or constituencies. And James Pearce's Camera Obscura 1C, another good example of counterfunctionality and shifting perspectives. But also things I didn't look at more closely in the book, and this is Christina Anderson's magic machine workshops, and really trying to understand the relationship to things not as technology, but to what their relationships might be with those who make things and why we make things. And I think that's a great example of kind of a set of repertoires that can help us work through design with. And this is the work by Rachel Clark and Ministry of Non-Human Species, in which she examines the role with others about what is a city for non-humans or animals, in which people take on the perspective or aim to take on the perspective of different animals and perceive, sort of, this is the transmogrification. They change themselves in a way to understand what it would be like to live in a city as a non-human animal. And Sin Lu's examinations of what she calls decomposition, and so trying to understand the agency of materials as not just something that creates something new, but actually through the process of decomposing, something new is made. And we can think about that very much in relation to other ecological ways of making, whether that be through, again, fermentation or decay or whatever, but it's enabling a genetic capacity, a trajectory, a non-human trajectory, and finding ways in which that can work to create and make things. And Doña Ojes's work, which she calls weaving stories, but also stories of things, and she takes on different strategies to kind of explore the role of things in design processes, as another particular kind of speculative repertoire or strategy to really bring to the foreground, share center stage with non-humans in the design process. And so in the last part of this chapter, I talked about how I use two terms throughout the book, relationality and expansiveness. And it was at the end of the writing that I came to realize, oh, wait a minute, I could have just used the term generosity. And I think it's this notion of generosity that is very much in the spirit of design with. So if we think about, we take a step back, we think about as a designer, think about design and what would be a generous understanding of design, one in which it was a plurality of different ways of designing and designing different somethings, and a way in which that didn't have to have a shared or a single foundation, but one in which could embrace different perspectives, different practices, different knowings in the way in which we design. So this idea of generosity and understanding design. And in relation to the things that we design, that we can see them as shaping us, so that they're not just passive, that we see them as more generous light, where they shape us as we shape them, and this interconnectedness between them, and also perhaps that they are as transformative of the world as we are, and again a generous perspective to see this and understand this, and when we are designing a thing. And lastly, a generosity in understanding the designer and who is at one side. How do we, who do we design with? What does it mean to share center stage or share stage with more than human participants and actors in thinking about design? And who do we and how do we include in the decision making about even what kind of designer or what kind of thing might be designed, or do we need to design? Opening up to the politics, opening up to the matters of concern and the matters of care that go into the notion of not just what it is you're designing, but who and what should be designing. And it is this kind of generosity that in the end I think is just a degree of respect and humility for the world in which we cohabit and the world in which we seek to design.